December 22, 1944, late morning. Southeast of Bastogne, Belgium. Private Leo Palma watched from his foxhole as four figures emerged from the tree line. White flag, two officers, two enlisted men walking slowly across the frozen field toward Company F of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. Palma glanced at his buddy in the next foxhole. The Germans had been trying to kill them for 3 days straight. Now they wanted to talk? The senior German officer carried a briefcase under his arm. He stopped at the American forward positions and requested to speak with the commanding officer. Within minutes, word was racing down the line. The Germans were here under a white flag. Maybe they'd had enough. Maybe they were giving up. The rumor was wrong. Inside the briefcase were two typed pages, one in English, one in German. The senior officer handed them over. An American major read the English version. His face went cold. It wasn't a surrender offer, it was a demand. The Germans wanted the Americans to surrender. 2 hours to decide. After that, total annihilation. The message traveled up the chain of command to division headquarters in Bastogne. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, was asleep when his chief of staff woke him with impossible news. The Germans have sent some people forward to take our surrender. McAuliffe, still half asleep, said one word: nuts. How did the most elite division in the American army end up surrounded and outnumbered in a frozen Belgian town? What would one general's single-word reply mean for the men fighting in the snow, and what was happening 100 miles south that would determine whether any of them lived to see the new year? 6 days earlier, nobody expected a German attack. The Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg was the quiet sector. Thick forests, rough terrain, narrow roads winding through steep hills. The Allied command considered it unsuitable for major operations. They'd thinned out the line there, placing inexperienced divisions in positions where nothing much was expected to happen. The 28th Infantry Division held the sector near Bastogne. They'd been fighting continuously since July and needed rest. This seemed like the perfect place to give it to them. The Germans had different ideas. Adolf Hitler had been planning this offensive since September. Germany was losing. The Soviets were grinding forward from the east. The Americans and British were closing from the west. Hitler needed a dramatic victory to force the Western Allies into a negotiated peace. Then he could turn his full strength against the Soviets. His plan was audacious and desperate in equal measure. Smash through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, capture the port of Antwerp, split the American and British armies, force them to negotiate. The operation would require everything Germany had left: over 200,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, complete surprise, and perfect weather to keep Allied aircraft grounded. Hitler called it Watch on the Rhine. The Americans would call it the Battle of the Bulge. At 0530 hours on December 16, 1944, German artillery opened fire across the entire Ardennes front. 2 hours of bombardment tore apart American positions. Telephone lines went dead. Command posts disappeared under shell fire. Then the infantry came. Then the panzers. The 28th Infantry Division fought desperately but couldn't hold. German mechanized columns poured through gaps in the line. Within hours, the Germans had created a bulge 30 miles wide and 15 miles deep in the Allied front. Panic spread through American rear areas. Nobody knew how far the Germans would get. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, was in Paris when news of the breakthrough arrived. He immediately understood what mattered most. The Germans were driving for the Meuse River crossings. To reach them, they had to go through Bastogne. Bastogne was nothing special to look at. A small Belgian market town, population around 4,000, but 7 major roads converged there. Every German armored column needed those roads. Control Bastogne, control the offensive. Lose Bastogne, and the German advance would bog down in the forest, trying to find alternate routes. Eisenhower ordered the only reserves he had into the breach. The 82nd Airborne Division would go to the northern shoulder of the Bulge. The 101st Airborne Division would go to Bastogne. Both divisions were in Reims, France, recovering from their battering during Operation Market Garden 3 months earlier. They were under strength, short on equipment, and had no winter clothing. They'd have to do. The 101st got the order on December 17. Pack up and move out. Destination: Bastogne, 107 miles away. No time for proper preparation. Just go. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded in the absence of Major General Maxwell Taylor, who was attending a conference in Washington. McAuliffe was an artillery officer, steady and competent, not given to drama. At 46 years old, he'd spent most of the war in staff positions. Now he'd lead the 101st into what looked like a death trap. The division moved by truck convoy through the night of December 17-18. They arrived in Bastogne just 4 hours ahead of the leading German units. 4 hours. If the convoy had been delayed, if the trucks had broken down, if anything had gone wrong, the Germans would have taken Bastogne unopposed. But the 101st made it. Barely. McAuliffe established his command post in the Heinz Barracks in the center of town. He sent his regiments to establish a defensive perimeter around Bastogne. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment went southeast. The 502nd went north. The 506th went northeast. The 327th Glider Infantry took the southern approaches. He had about 14,000 men total, including attached units. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division was already there, having delayed the German advance long enough for the 101st to arrive. McAuliffe folded them into his defense. He also got the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which arrived on December 19. The tank destroyers gave him some anti-armor capability, but not much. The 101st was a light infantry division. No tanks, no heavy weapons, just paratroopers with rifles, machine guns, bazookas, and artillery. The Germans hit the perimeter on December 19. Panzer Leroy Division attacked from the east. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division came from the southeast. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division probed from the north. The attacks were fierce but uncoordinated. The Germans assaulted one section of the perimeter at a time instead of hitting everywhere at once. This allowed McAuliffe's artillery to concentrate fire and break up each attack before it could penetrate. By December 20, Bastogne was completely surrounded. All 7 roads were cut. No supplies coming in. No wounded going out. The 101st was on its own. The situation looked grim. American forces outnumbered 5-1. Ammunition running low. Medical supplies nearly exhausted. Food down to 1 meal per day. The weather was brutal. Temperatures dropping below freezing. Snow on the ground. Fog so thick you couldn't see 100 yards. And every soldier was still wearing the same uniform he'd worn in France. No winter gear. No overcoats. Just regular field jackets that did almost nothing against the cold. Major Dick Winters, commanding 2nd Battalion of the 506th, summed up the situation with typical paratrooper attitude. When a soldier told him they'd be surrounded in Bastogne, Winters replied, "We're paratroopers. We're supposed to be surrounded." The men dug in and waited, foxholes in frozen ground, slit trenches covered with pine branches for concealment, machine gun positions carved into the snow. The 101st had jumped into Normandy. They'd held Hell's Highway in Holland. They knew how to fight when things looked bad. But this was different. In Normandy, they'd been behind enemy lines for days. In Holland, relief had come within hours. Here at Bastogne, nobody knew if relief was coming at all. The Germans knew the Americans were trapped. Their commanders believed it was only a matter of time before the 101st ran out of ammunition and surrendered. Why waste men in costly attacks when you could just wait for the defenders to collapse? But the German timetable didn't allow for waiting. The offensive was already behind schedule. Taking Bastogne quickly was essential. Every day the 101st held meant another day the German advance stalled. On December 21, the weather got worse. Fog settled over everything. Snow fell intermittently. The Americans couldn't see more than a few dozen yards. More importantly, Allied aircraft couldn't fly. The 101st was supposed to be resupplied by airdrops. With the weather grounded, no supplies arrived. Ammunition stocks kept dropping. Artillery battalions rationed shells. Infantry companies rationed rifle ammunition. Machine gunners were told to fire only when they had clear targets. The wounded suffered most. Belgian civilians opened their homes, churches, and cellars to serve as aid stations. Belgian nurses and housewives tended American soldiers as best they could, but medical supplies were running out. Morphine was gone. Bandages were being reused. Blood plasma was down to the last few units. Doctors performed surgery with cognac as the only anesthetic. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical care. On December 22nd, the Germans decided to offer the Americans a way out. General Heinrich Freiherr von Leutwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps besieging Bastogne. He'd been ordered to take the town quickly and couldn't understand why the Americans were still fighting. They were surrounded. They were outnumbered. They were freezing and starving. Surely they understood the situation was hopeless. Perhaps they just needed a formal invitation to surrender. Leutwitz drafted an ultimatum. It was typed on 2 sheets of paper, one in English and one in German. An English typewriter was used, which meant the diacritical marks on the German version had to be added by hand. The message was formal, almost courteous in tone, but the threat was clear. The ultimatum read, "To the USA, commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. More German armored units have crossed the river Artha near Orthoville, have taken Marche and reached St. Hubert by passing through Humpressibret-Tillet. Libremont is in German hands. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. In order to think it over, a term of 2 hours will be granted beginning with the presentation of this note." The message continued with warnings about civilian casualties if the Americans refused. It promised fair treatment as prisoners of war if they accepted. It was signed by the German commander. 4 German soldiers carried this message forward under a white flag. Major Wagner, Lieutenant Helmuth Henke, and 2 enlisted men approached the American lines southeast of Bastogne around 11:30 in the morning on December 22. Private Leo Palma and his squad watched them come. The Germans were blindfolded and taken to the company command post. Major Jones read the message, called regiment, who called division. The message made its way up the chain of command to McAuliffe's headquarters in less than 30 minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore woke McAuliffe from a nap. McAuliffe was exhausted. He'd been awake for most of the past 72 hours coordinating the defense. Moore told him the Germans wanted their surrender. McAuliffe's first reaction was the natural one. He laughed. Then he said nuts and started climbing out of his sleeping bag to deal with this ridiculous situation. Moore went back to the communications center and briefed the division staff. He mentioned McAuliffe's reaction. When Major Jones arrived with the actual ultimatum, the staff read it carefully. The message was long-winded and pompous. The threat of total annihilation seemed absurd given that the 101st had been beating back German attacks for 3 days. McAuliffe joined the staff officers and read the ultimatum himself. He agreed it deserved a response. The Germans had sent a formal message. Military courtesy required a formal reply. He sat down with pencil and paper to compose one. After a few minutes, he admitted he didn't know what to write. The situation seemed clear enough. The 101st wasn't surrendering. But how to phrase it in a way that conveyed appropriate contempt for the German demand? Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer, offered a suggestion. "What you said initially would be hard to beat, General." McAuliffe wasn't sure what Kinnard meant. "Sir, you said nuts," Kinnard reminded him. The other staff officers burst into applause. Perfect, brief, clear, dismissive, everything a response should be. McAuliffe wrote it down and ordered it typed up. The official reply, on proper military letterhead, read, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." That was it. 4 words, one of them underlined for emphasis. Colonel Joseph Harper volunteered to deliver the response personally. He took the typed message and walked out to where the German officers were waiting, still blindfolded. Harper had the blindfolds removed and handed Wagner the paper. Wagner read it and looked confused. His English was good enough to read the words, but he didn't understand the meaning. Nuts wasn't a term he recognized in this context. Harper clarified helpfully. "It means the same as go to hell, and I'll tell you something else. If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." Wagner stiffened. "We will kill many Americans. This is war." "On your way, bud," Harper replied, "and good luck to you." The German officers were re-blindfolded and escorted back through the American lines. They returned to their own positions, carrying McAuliffe's one-word answer. The German commanders were not amused. The German response to the American refusal was immediate and brutal. If the 101st wouldn't surrender, they'd be destroyed. On the night of December 22-23, the Luftwaffe launched a bombing raid against Bastogne. German aircraft had been largely absent from the skies over the battlefield due to fuel shortages and Allied air superiority, but for this mission, enough fuel was scraped together for 4 nights of sustained bombing. The bombs fell on military and civilian targets without discrimination. The Heinz barracks took several direct hits. Buildings throughout Bastogne collapsed into rubble. Belgian civilians who'd taken refuge in cellars found themselves buried under debris. American soldiers in foxholes around the perimeter listened to the explosions in town and knew their comrades were dying. The aid stations suffered worst. Wounded men who'd survived combat were killed by bombs falling on the churches and buildings where they lay. Doctors and nurses died alongside their patients. Medical supplies that were already scarce were destroyed completely. The carnage was appalling. Christmas Day 1944 would produce one of the war's most haunting photographs. It shows McAuliffe and his staff sitting around a small, pathetic Christmas tree made from a few evergreen branches. The men look exhausted, hollow-eyed, grim. There's no Christmas cheer in that room, just determination to survive another day. But December 23 brought something besides German bombs. It brought clear skies. The fog that had blanketed Bastogne for days finally lifted. For the first time since the siege began, Allied aircraft could see the ground. 9th Air Force Headquarters in England immediately ordered a maximum effort. Every available transport aircraft would fly to Bastogne. Every available fighter-bomber would attack German positions around the perimeter. At 3 in the afternoon on December 23, the roar of aircraft engines echoed across Bastogne. American soldiers looked up and saw the most beautiful sight they'd ever witnessed. C-47 transport aircraft, hundreds of them, flying in formation toward the town. The side doors opened and parachutes blossomed. Red, white, blue, and yellow chutes filled the sky as supply bundles dropped toward the perimeter. The men of the 101 first went crazy. They cheered, they shouted, they waved their helmets in the air. They'd been slowly starving for 4 days. Now ammunition, food, medical supplies, and medicine were falling from the sky. Soldiers raced across open ground, under German fire to retrieve the containers. They didn't care about the danger. They needed those supplies desperately. Not every bundle landed inside the perimeter. Some drifted into German-held areas. The Germans got American cigarettes, K-rations, and ammunition, but most of the supplies reached the 101 first. More importantly, the sight of those aircraft proved the 101 first wasn't alone. The rest of the army knew where they were and was trying to help. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers followed the transports. The Thunderbolts dove on German positions with rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire. They targeted the German tanks that had been painted green and brown for summer fighting. Against the snow, those tanks stood out perfectly. The Thunderbolts destroyed dozens of panzers in the first hours of the attack. The air support completely changed the tactical situation. The Germans, who'd been pressing attacks confidently, suddenly found themselves on the defensive. Every time they massed troops for an assault, P-47s would appear and tear them apart. Every road they used for reinforcement became a killing ground. The German advantage in numbers meant less when American aircraft could see every movement. But the siege wasn't over. The Germans still surrounded Bastogne. They still outnumbered the defenders, and they were preparing another major assault. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, McAuliffe wrote a message to his division. The message was part inspiration, part information, and entirely honest about their situation. It was read aloud to every unit in the perimeter. "What's merry about all this, you ask? We're fighting. It's cold. We aren't home." All true, but what has the proud Eagle Division accomplished with its worthy comrades of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and all the rest? Just this: we have stopped cold everything that has been thrown at us from the north, east, south, and west. We have identifications from 4 German panzer divisions, 2 German infantry divisions, and 1 German parachute division. These units, spearheading the last desperate German lunge, were heading straight west for key points when the Eagle Division was hurriedly ordered to stem the advance. How effectively this was done will be written in history. We are giving our country and our loved ones at home a worthy Christmas present, and being privileged to take part in this gallant feat of arms are truly making for ourselves a Merry Christmas." The men appreciated the sentiment even if they didn't feel particularly merry. They were cold, hungry, scared, and exhausted, but they were still fighting. The German Christmas Day assault came at dawn on December 25. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, reinforced with a Panzer Grenadier Regiment, attacked the western side of the perimeter. The assault was preceded by heavy artillery fire. Then the tanks came. The German panzers penetrated the American line at several points. For a few desperate hours, it looked like the defense might crack. German tanks were inside the perimeter, advancing toward the town center. American bazookamen stalked them through the snow, getting close enough for killing shots. Artillery fired at point-blank range. Tank destroyers engaged in close-quarters duels. The American line bent but didn't break. Every German penetration was contained, then counterattacked. By mid-afternoon, all the German tanks that had broken through were burning hulks. Their infantry, caught in the open without armor support, were cut down by machine gun fire. The Christmas Day assault failed completely. That same afternoon, far to the south, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stood on a hill and watched the supply parachutes falling on Bastogne. Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion, part of the 4th Armored Division. His division had been fighting for days to break through to Bastogne. Now they were close, very close. Abrams had no way of knowing that his tanks would arrive just in time. 150 miles away, General George Patton was orchestrating the most remarkable military maneuver of his career. Patton commanded the Third Army, which had been attacking eastward in northeastern France when the German offensive began. When Eisenhower called his commanders to a crisis meeting on December 19, everyone expected Patton to explode at having his offensive canceled. Instead, Patton surprised them. He was ready to turn his entire army 90 degrees north and counterattack into the Bulge. When Eisenhower asked how long it would take, Patton said 48 hours. He could attack with 2 divisions within 2 days. The other generals in the room thought Patton was crazy or lying. Turning an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter in 48 hours? Impossible. It would take weeks to coordinate the logistics, the movements, the traffic control. No commander could do what Patton was promising. But Patton had prepared for exactly this contingency. Before leaving for the meeting, he'd ordered his staff to develop 3 different plans for a northward turn. By the time Eisenhower asked the question, Patton's Third Army was already beginning the turn. Within hours, over 250,000 men, thousands of tanks and trucks, and hundreds of artillery pieces were moving north on frozen roads. Patton chose 3 divisions for the initial attack: the 80th Infantry Division on the right flank, the 26th Infantry Division in the center, and the 4th Armored Division on the left. The 4th Armored would take the most direct route to Bastogne. The 4th Armored was one of Patton's favorites. It had fought across France with distinction, earning a reputation as one of the best armored divisions in the army. Major General Hugh Gaffey commanded. Patton expected them to lead the way to Bastogne, and they intended to do exactly that. The attack jumped off on December 22. The same day, McAuliffe told the Germans, "Nuts." Patton's tanks started north. The weather was appalling: snow, ice, temperatures well below freezing. Roads that were barely adequate in summer became nightmares in winter. Tanks slipped and slid, supply trucks got stuck, men froze in their vehicles, and the Germans fought back ferociously. The German defenders weren't the exhausted, demoralized troops the Allies had been fighting since Normandy. These were fresh divisions pulled from the strategic reserve. They'd been told the offensive was their last chance to turn the war around. They fought with desperate determination. Every village became a fortress. Every hill became a strong point. German anti-tank guns destroyed American tanks at long range. Panzerfaust teams ambushed columns at close range. Artillery plastered crossroads and road junctions. The 4th Armored Division advanced through a continuous battle. Patton was relentless. He visited every division headquarters, every corps command post. He pushed his commanders to move faster, attack harder, keep the pressure on. His staff worked around the clock coordinating movements, solving logistics problems, redirecting units, The 12th Army Group staff, though officially out of the command loop, worked alongside Patton's staff to make the impossible happen. Private First Class James Fenchel sat in the driver's seat of his M5 Stuart light tank on the night of December 22. His unit, part of the 4th Armored Division's advance guard, had been driving all night. They were exhausted, cold, and running on adrenaline, but they kept moving. Patton had ordered them to keep moving, and nobody disobeyed Patton's orders. Fenchel's tank was part of the leading edge, pushing ahead to maintain contact with the Germans. Driving a tank at night was miserable. The visibility was terrible. The roads were icy. At one point, Fenchel lost sight of the Stuart ahead of him in the darkness. When it suddenly appeared, he drove right into it. Both tanks stopped. Crews scrambled out to assess damage, found nothing serious, and kept going. They refueled on December 23 and kept going. Sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford. Bastogne was ahead, and men were dying there while waiting for relief. The 4th Armored Division advanced on 3 axes, using all 3 of its combat commands. Combat Command A attacked in the east. Combat Command B took the center. Combat Command Reserve went west. The division hoped one of the columns would find a weak spot in the German defenses and exploit it. Combat Command Reserve, under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, made the fastest progress. On December 24, Christmas Eve, Abrams' tanks pushed through Bougainville and continued north. They were now less than 10 miles from Bastogne. The defenders could almost see them coming. Almost. The final German defensive line stood between Abrams and Bastogne. The village of Esnois, 5 miles southwest of the town, was heavily defended. The Germans knew it was the key. If Esnois fell, the corridor to Bastogne would open. They packed the village with infantry, anti-tank guns, and tanks. Abrams prepared his final assault for December 26. He'd push straight up the road from Esnois to Bastogne with maximum force. No subtlety, no flanking maneuvers, just a direct armored charge supported by infantry and artillery. Breakthrough or die trying. The attack began at dawn on December 26. Lieutenant Charles Bogus commanded Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion. His tank, a Sherman named Cobra King, would lead the assault. Behind him came the rest of the company, followed by armored infantry and more tanks. The column roared out of Bougainville at maximum speed. Bogus had orders to go as fast as possible. Don't stop to fight, just break through. Infantry following behind would deal with German positions that the tanks bypassed. Cobra King hit Assenois at high speed. German anti-tank guns opened fire. One Sherman was hit and destroyed. Another took a round that killed the commander. But the column kept moving. Infantry jumped from their half-tracks and fought building to building through Assenois while the tanks charged through. Bogus emerged from Assenois with the road to Bastogne ahead. He could see the town, 4 miles. He pushed the throttle forward and Cobra King accelerated. Behind him, the rest of the column followed. German infantry fired at them from the woods on both sides. Bogus didn't stop. He kept driving north. At 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26, 1944, Cobra King rolled into the positions of the 326 engineers on the southern edge of Bastogne. Lieutenant Bogus stood up in his turret and looked around. American paratroopers emerged from foxholes, grinning and cheering. The siege was broken. Within hours, more tanks and trucks poured through the corridor. Medical supplies arrived. Wounded were evacuated. Ammunition and food flowed in. The 101st wasn't surrounded anymore. That evening, Patton wrote in his diary, "What a glorious day for killing Germans." He also wrote to his wife Beatrice, describing the relief of Bastogne as the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed, and it is in my opinion the outstanding achievement of this war. For once, Patton wasn't exaggerating. The siege was lifted, but the battle wasn't over. The Germans immediately tried to cut the corridor and re-encircle Bastogne. For the next 2 weeks, fighting around the town was more intense than during the siege itself. The 101st, reinforced now with fresh units, pushed out from the defensive perimeter. They attacked the German positions that had surrounded them, capturing villages they'd been forced to abandon in December. Places like Foy and Neuville, which had been German strongpoints, fell to American counterattacks. The 101st wasn't being rescued anymore. They were attacking. The battered bastards of Bastogne, as several regiments came to be known, were taking the war to the enemy. The fighting continued through January. The German offensive, which had been stopped at Bastogne, gradually collapsed across the entire front. McAuliffe became famous almost overnight. When the story of his nuts reply reached the press, it created a sensation. Newspapers across America ran the story on their front pages. McAuliffe, who'd spent most of his career as an artillery officer and staff officer, suddenly became one of the most recognizable generals in the army. He hated it. For the rest of his life, McAuliffe grew tired of being introduced at dinners and events as the man who told the Germans nuts. McAuliffe died in 1975 and was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His grave is near the graves of men who fought under him at Bastogne, men who died in the snow defending that Belgian crossroads. The 101st Airborne Division received the Presidential Unit Citation for their defense of Bastogne. The citation read in part, "The 101st Airborne Division stood alone and held for 7 days against 5 German divisions. They stopped the German drive cold. The siege of Bastogne stopped that from happening. For 7 days, the 101 first denied the Germans the one thing they needed most, freedom of movement. Every German unit that tried to advance west had to go around Bastogne. Every supply column had to take longer, more difficult routes. Every hour the 101st held meant another hour for the Allies to bring up reinforcements. The tank named Cobra King, which was first to break through to Bastogne, eventually ended up at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The Sherman sits there now, preserved as a memorial to the relief of Bastogne and the men who fought to achieve it. In 2024, on the 80th anniversary of the siege, troops from the modern 101st Airborne Division returned to Bastogne for a series of commemorative events. Over 100 soldiers from Fort Campbell, Kentucky made the journey. They stood in place McAuliffe and listened to veterans who'd been there in 1944. Vincent Speranza, a machine gunner during the siege, returned at age 99. He described the moment on December 19 when the 101st opened fire on German infantry advancing across an open field. The snow turned red, he recalled. When they got to 400 yards, the lieutenant said, "Now," and we opened up with everything we had. It was a slaughter. The Germans learned that morning that taking Bastogne wouldn't be easy. They learned it again on December 20, December 21, December 22, and every day until December 26. By the time the siege was lifted, the Germans had committed 4 panzer divisions, 2 infantry divisions, and 1 parachute division to taking 1 Belgian town defended by light infantry. They failed. 4 German soldiers had walked through the snow on December 22, 1944, carrying a surrender ultimatum. They returned to their lines with a one-word answer: nuts. That single word came to symbolize American defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. But the real story of Bastogne wasn't about one word. It was about 14,000 men who refused to quit when quitting made sense. It was about soldiers who fought from foxholes in sub-zero temperatures with dwindling ammunition and no winter clothing. It was about Belgian civilians who sheltered American wounded in their cellars and churches. It was about pilots who flew through terrible weather to drop supplies by parachute. It was about tankers who drove through the night for days to break a siege. The Germans mocked the Americans trapped at Bastogne. They offered surrender as the only rational choice. They promised annihilation if that offer was refused. They believed the surrounded garrison would collapse within days. They were wrong about everything. The 101st held for 7 days. Patton's tanks broke through on the 8th day. Together, they turned Hitler's last great offensive into his final defeat. The Battle of the Bulge cost Germany resources it couldn't replace and demonstrated that American forces could absorb a surprise attack and counterattack decisively. From December 1944 forward, the outcome of the war in Europe was no longer in doubt. Bastogne proved that determination matters more than numbers, that courage under fire can overcome tactical disadvantage, that when soldiers believe in their mission and trust their leaders, they can accomplish things that look impossible on paper. The men who defended Bastogne never forgot what they'd done there. Neither should we. They stood in the snow and told the German army to go to hell. Then they backed up those words with 7 days of fighting that changed the course of the war. If you found this story of courage under siege and dramatic relief compelling, please like this video, subscribe to WW2 Tales to stay connected with history that matters, the desperate stands, the impossible odds, the refusals to surrender. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and which moment of the Bastogne siege struck you most powerfully. Thank you for watching and for remembering that sometimes the right word at the right moment is nuts.